The A and B class destroyers were a group of 18 destroyers built for the Royal Navy during the late 1920s, with 2 additional ships built for the Royal Canadian Navy. The British ships were divided into 2 flotillas of 8 destroyers, each with a flotilla leader. Design and description. The A-class design was derived from the 1926 prototype SAMAs in an ambuscade for the 1927-28 Naval Construction Program. The initial staff requirements were unrealistic and would have resulted in a much larger, unaffordable ship. They were scaled back, both to reduce the size of the ship and to save money. Nonetheless, the design had an improved gun armament, heavier torpedo armament, and greater range, at the cost of 2 knots of speed. In comparison with the prototypes, these were fitted with the 2-speed destroyer sweep minesweeping gear and only had a residual anti-submarine ability, while the Bs were equipped with Type 119 ASDIC and had a full complement of depth charges, but could not use the TSDS. This was the beginning of the Admiralty's policy of alternating TSDS and anti-submarine capabilities between destroyer flotillas. The ships displaced 1,350–1,360 long tons at standard load and 1,778–1,790 long tons at deep load. They had an overall length of 323 feet, a beam of 32 feet 3 inches, and a draft of 12 feet 3 inches. The A-class had a metacentric height of 1.76 feet at deep load. The ship's complement was 138 officers and ratings as built, but increased in size up to 162 during the war. The destroyers were powered by 2 Parsons-geared steam turbines, each driving 1 propeller shaft, using steam provided by 3 water tube boilers equipped with superheaters. 5 of these and all of the Bs had Admiralty 3-drum boilers that operated at a pressure of 300 pounds per square inch and a temperature of 600 degrees Fahrenheit, while Ardent and Antony were fitted with Yarrow boilers of 275 psi pressure at the same temperature. Acheron was given experimental Thornycroft boilers that had a working pressure of 500 psi and a temperature of 750 degrees Fahrenheit to examine the weight and economy savings. Her specific fuel consumption was reduced from 0.8 pounds HP per hour in her sisters to 0.6 pounds HP per hour, although she was plagued by mechanical problems for her whole life. In the event, the trials were inconclusive, and the Admiralty continued to use the lower temperature and pressure Admiralty 3-drum boiler until the battle class of 1942. Nearly 10 years after other major navies began to use higher pressure and temperature boilers, the turbines developed a total of 34,000 shaft horsepower for a design speed of 35 knots, and the ship exceeded that during the sea trials. The destroyers carried a maximum of 388 to 390 long tons of fuel oil that gave them a range of 4,800 nautical miles at 15 knots. All of the ships had the same main armament, 4 quick-firing 4.7-INCH Mark 9 guns in single mounts with enlarged gun shields, designated A, B, X, and Y, from front to rear. Although the A-class were intended to be equipped with gun mounts that could elevate up to 40 degrees, and B gun on a high-angle mount capable of 60 degrees, all 4 guns ultimately had a maximum elevation of 30 degrees. They fired a 50-pound shell at a muzzle velocity of 2,650 feet per second to a range of 16,970 yards. Each gun was provided with 190 rounds for anti-aircraft defense. The A and B class ships carried two 40mm QF 2-pounder Mark II AA guns mounted on platforms between the funnels, each with 500 rounds. They were fitted with two quadruple mounts for 21-inch torpedo tubes. The A-class ships were initially going to be fitted with two throwers and four chutes for 8 depth charges, but they interfered with the TSDS equipments of the throwers. 1 chute and 2 depth charges were removed. The Bs were equipped with 2 throwers and 1 rack for 20 depth charges. While not initially fitted with ASDIC, space was reserved for it, and at least some of these received it beginning in the late 1930s. The fire control system for these ships was little advanced over the First World War era predecessors. A pedestal-mounted, manually operated destroyer director sight and a separate 9-foot rangefinder position to its rear were situated above the bridge. The director sent elevation and traverse orders to the main guns and the searchlight using data derived from the rangefinder. They had no capability for anti-aircraft fire, and the anti-aircraft guns were aimed solely by eye. No fire control computer was initially installed, but an Admiralty fire control clock Mark II was retrofitted after it had been proven in the subsequent C-class destroyers. Canadian ships. The two Canadian ships were designed to be of a similar performance to the A-class ships to allow them to tactically combine. More flair was given to the boat to keep it drier, and the forward part of the hull was strengthened to withstand ice. The metacentric height was increased to allow for the build-up of ice and snow on the upperworks, and they were 3 feet shorter than their British counterparts. Although the ships had an additional 50 long tons of fuel, 2,000 shp fewer horsepower, and lacked superheaters for the boilers, they had the same range and speed as the brethren of the A and B classes. They displaced 1,337 long tons at standard load and 1,805 long tons at deep load. The ships were built by John I, Thornycroft and Amp Company in Woolston, Hampshire, and had the broad, slab-sided funnels characteristic of that builder. Flotilla leaders. Codrington was built to an enlarged design to accommodate the commander of the destroyer flotilla and his staff. Some 47 additional officers and ratings. The ship displaced roughly 200 long tons more than the private ships at standard load and 2,012 long tons at deep load. She was 20 feet longer overall and had a beam 1 foot wider. She shipped a 5th 4.7-INCH gun between the funnels, which forced the 2-pounders to be repositioned abaft the rear funnel, and was not fitted with TSDS to compensate for her greater size. Codrington's oil tanks were increased by 40 long tons, and her turbines were rated at 39,000 shp to give her the same range and speed as the private ships, but she proved to be significantly faster as she made 37.7 knots during her sea trials. However, the increased length made her somewhat unhandy, having a turning circle much greater than the standard A-class, which complicated maneuvers with her flotilla. Unlike Codrington, Keith was built upon the same hull as her sisters to save money and to make her tactically identical to her flotilla mates. The initial proposal was to enlarge the aft-deck house to make room for the captain and his staff at the expense of Y gun and the TSDS gear, but the gun was reinstated while she was under construction. The ship was too small to accommodate the entirety of the staff, and Blanche was fitted as a divisional leader to carry the surplus. Keith was 40 long tons heavier than the private ships at standard load and nearly 100 long tons heavier at full load and 1,821 long tons, respectively, and carried 19 additional officers and ratings. Wartime modifications. The initial wartime modifications were limited and mostly related to the survivability of the crew. Aside from the addition of 50 rounds per gun of 4.7-inch ammunition and the increase of depth charge stowage to 42. Beginning in May 1940, the afterbank of torpedo tubes was removed in most ships and replaced with a QF 3-inch 20 cwt anti-aircraft gun, the aftermast and funnel being cut down to improve the gun's field of fire. Of the early war losses, only Codrington and Acheron received this modification before they were sunk. By October, all of the surviving A-class ships plus Beagle, Boadicea, Boreas and Brilliant had been modified, and the rest of the Bs had received theirs by April 1941. Beginning in 1941, most ships had Y-gun and the TSDS gear replaced by racks and throwers for a pattern of 10 depth charges, with stowage increased to 70 charges. The light AA armament was augmented by a pair of QF Lycon 20mm guns, one each abreast the bridge, and a Type 286 short-range surface search radar adapted from the Royal Air Force's ASV radar was also added. The early models, however, could only scan directly forward and had to be aimed by turning the entire ship. The Canadian ships replaced the 2-pounders with a pair of quadruple 0.5-inch machine guns and were not fitted with the Lycons by 1942. Late that year, some of the surviving ships were further modified into what became known as Escort Destroyers. These ships had either A or B gun replaced by a Hedgehog anti-submarine spigot mortar. Hackett's, Beagle, Boreas, and Bulldog were among the first ships to be converted. Around this same time, many ships had the destroyer director sight and rangefinder exchanged for a Type 271 target indication radar. Beagle and Bulldog were later fitted with a 2-pounder boat chaser to engage German E-boats in the English Channel, while Boadicea received 2 elderly 6-pounder Hotchkiss guns to deal with U-boats on the surface at close range. Beginning in 1943, the 3-inch gun was removed to allow for the installation of a Huff-Duff radio direction finder on a short mainmast. The aft torpedo tubes were sometimes reinstalled. The single 20mm guns abreast the bridge were replaced by Mark V powered mountings for twin weapons later in the war, the singles replacing the 2-pounder or 50 caliber guns amidships, with a further pair of Lycons that replaced the searchlight between the torpedo tubes. Ships: A-class ships, B-class ships. Service: The class saw much service in the Second World War, being involved in convoy protection and anti-submarine warfare in home waters and the North Atlantic. 7 of the 11 ships of the class were sunk in World War II. Acasta and Ardent were sunk on 8 June 1940 by the German battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau west of Narvik during the Norwegian campaign. Codrington was sunk by German air attack at Dover on 27 July 1940. Acheron was sunk by a mine off the Isle of Wight on 17 December 1940. Hackett's was sunk by 2 large German heavy cruisers, Admiral Hipper and Lutzow. Arrow was so badly damaged when the ammunition ship Flotilla Monty blew up on 4 August 1943 at Algiers that she could not be repaired and was towed to Taranto and paid off. Skeena was wrecked in a storm off Iceland on 25 October 1944. Sagny was heavily damaged in a collision with the merchant ship Zara and was consigned to the role of a training ship after being repaired. The surviving ships were worn out from war duties and were scrapped soon after the war.